of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. These are the opening lines of Charles Dickens' classic A Tale of Two Cities. And the world now is coming to a critical point in time. The current international landscape is witnessing unprecedented changes. China's Minister of Foreign Affairs Wang commented that 2018 was marked by uncertainty. This accelerated shift of power balances, the rising tide of unilateralism and protectionism, and non-traditional security challenges like climate change have exposed this world to profound instability. How should China navigate the unknown that lies ahead in a steadfast manner? How will major country relations evolve and in turn shape the world at large? And how can we safeguard and improve the existing world order that has led the world to today since the end of the Second World War? Welcome to a special edition of The Point, an opinion show with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. Joining us in the studio are Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, Einar Tangen, a current affairs commentator, and from Brussels, Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor of European Policy Center. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Mr. Cameron, let me go to you first. I know Europe, in terms of its relations with China, might not have been the most eventful in the year 2018, and yet looking back, what would be the adjective that you would use to describe the relationship between China and Europe?
Very pragmatic. I think the summit in July in Beijing showed that the two sides have a great deal of common interest. I would single out two in particular. One, trade, to preserve the WTO. It needs reforming, but international trade is at a critical juncture just now, and I think the EU and China, as the two most important players, have a key role to play. And second, climate change. I think at Katowice, the EU and China were on the same page. Again, they're two of the biggest players in tackling climate change. So I would say these are two of the key issues, and many others covering regional security and reforms in other areas. But I think the EU and China have shown that they can contribute to actually preserving the existing international order.
But at the same time, people would say Europe is not just one block of countries that have totally shared values and standpoints in terms of relations with China. For instance, while upholding a multilateral trading principle with China in the WTO, EU, together with Japan and the United States, have also issued several statements when it comes to condemning or pointing out China's so-called unfair trade practices. So how do you see the kind of dilemma that European countries, especially Western European countries, are faced with at this moment? And how do you foresee relations going forward in 2019?
I wouldn't say it's a dilemma. You have to take it in perspective. I mean, 95% of trade between the EU and China passes without any problem. We're talking about a relatively small number of areas, including, intellectual property, some areas of market access and forced technology transfer, which concern a number of companies. But this should not detract from the overall picture of a very strong trading relationship between the EU and China, which is becoming increasingly two-way also in terms of investment. I mean, China last year, and this is quite a landmark issue, became for the first time the larger investor in Europe compared to what the EU has been investing in China. Now, I think this will continue throughout 2019. I think it's going to be a period of change, firstly in Europe, because the leaders of the EU institutions will be changing, and secondly in China. They will be concentrating inevitably on internal pressures, but together we both have to deal with the problems of Washington, and in particular the mercurial personality of Trump and what he's going to do. And that is a big unknown, but I think the EU and China both have to come together and deal with that.
What are some of the key timelines that we have to keep in mind when looking at 2019? We know Brexit is supposedly to happen on the 29th of March, but whether or not it's going to happen smoothly, we do not know. So what would that mean for China's relationship with Europe as a whole? And to keep that relationship in a healthy manner, what do you think people in Europe have to do, and what do you think China will have to do or to bear in mind?
Well, it's one country that's leaving, an important country, but I think that the consequences of a no deal are so horrendous that there will eventually be a deal before the end of March. I think what it has shown is firstly the remarkable unity of the 27 member states who've stuck to their negotiating principles. It shows that they can work together as a unit. Similarly, I would say they've stuck together very well, dealing with Russia on the question of sanctions. And public support for the EU now is at an all-time high. And countries that were contemplating either dropping out of the Eurozone or even have another referendum in Europe, like Italy and France, that's gone now. I mean, there's much more commonality, even though there are divergences on issues like migration between the 27 member states. So I think it's going to be an upward trend, still problems in various areas, but the EU is much stronger together as 27, and I think every one of these 27 member states recognizes that because of what's been happening in the UK. And as for China, China has to deal... Sorry?
Go ahead, please.
Well, China has to deal, I think, with the European Union. Britain is going to be inward-looking for the next 5 or 10 years. This Brexit is not going to be over and finished on the 29th of March. I mean, Britain will be engaged in a further withdrawal agreement, and until that's sorted out, China can't sign a trade agreement with Britain, neither can any other country.
Okay, thank you very much, Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor of European Policy Centre, for joining us. And let me come back to the two gentlemen here in the studio, Mr. Einar Tangen and Professor Cui Hongjian. Now let's look at big country relations in 2018. As I said in the beginning of this program, Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang used the word uncertainty. How did you look at the situation? Do you agree with his assessment? I mean, uncertainty to many people would be quite a mild way to put things, right? And also, how has it been possible that China kind of navigated through the unexpected events relatively successfully? Professor Cui.
I think we need to understand firstly what does it mean for the uncertainty, especially in the relations between major players. I think uncertainty means that something happened unexpected. We have to, change our policy, and we have to introduce some more crisis management like that. So I think yes, 2018. That firstly, how could we deal with this challenge from United States, especially China-U.S. relations? As we know now, there's some trade war, some maybe more debates in other areas. But so far, I think that. Now, because this meeting between President Xi and President Trump, I found that now both sides try to go back to a more maybe stable track, especially to lead these relations. And of course, at the same time, I think we need to also take care of some other major relations in some among other players, including United States, Russia, and also Europe. Union and Russia and some other. So I think yes, we are facing a lot of the uncertainties, but I think it's also a very good opportunity for us to maybe to force us to try to have some more creation for some more solutions.
When you say force us to create more solutions, do you mean to force countries like China, or to force China itself to create more solutions? What kind of solutions is the Chinese leadership thinking of at this moment?
Yes, I think especially if we take the case of China-U.S. relations, we can find that at this moment it's some very, very maybe some expectation on some worse situation to help us.
Worst case scenario.
To help us to go back. For example, nobody in China and the United States we try to to be trapped into a kind of a deadlock, especially because us two big powers. So I think to some degree we have to go back. We have to find out a way to get out from the trap. So I think that's very important. So uncertainty is not only I think a totally bad thing, and also I hope that we can try to introduce some more new approach from this uncertainties.
Einar, some people are saying between China and the United States something is brewing, which sounds very much like a new Cold War, especially when you look at the speeches or suggestions from some hawkish figures in the Trump administration. People are getting the kind of feeling that the near future might not look very bright, very positive as some people would wish for. What is your take on the situation at this moment?
Well, I'm going back to my colleague's comments. There's two areas of uncertainty that are being created. One is on a personal basis with Donald Trump. I mean, his tweet diplomacy, you know, the turnover in his administration, it's just very hard to know what he's going to do. There was the issue about Syria, things like this. The second part is this instability that's caused by different systems. China started out very pragmatically 40 years ago, and they said, we're going to try a path, and our journey is towards a better life for our people. But that created a system which no one thought would last 40 years.
But why is this question coming out now? I mean, we have been developing for the past 40 years, and why nobody thought that China was not going to develop to the way the Western world wants us?
Yes, and no one objected to the Monroe Doctrine when it was the number 57 item on a State of the Union address given by the President at the time, and that was because there was no real meat to it. The fact is that China has risen very quickly, and now at this time, all right, it is being taken very seriously, and people are seeing everything that is different about China as opposed to what China actually is. Now, this is the major difference. China has risen very peacefully. It's very prickly about its boundaries, and that will continue. And I think Xi Jinping made that clear. But what you have is people saying, no, there's only one way the world can work, and that is liberal democratic capitalism. And because China doesn't embrace that completely, it has a slightly different form of the way it arranges things, it's a threat, implicitly, and especially because it's so successful, while the rest of the world is not. So there's this fear that things are changing, and they are. If you start looking at wealth creation, it's moved eastward. Wealth is still based in the West. If you take Europe and America, 60%. But if you take wealth creation, it's the exact opposite. 60% is happening in Asia.
Okay, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said in November last year in Singapore that China and the U.S. are bound to step on each other's toes around the world, and he warned of a world order defined by continuous conflict, though he himself is optimistic of this relationship in the long term. But some people are really saying that the old unipolar global world order is melting down. So, Professor Cui, do you buy this kind of argument, and that we're entering really a new kind of bipolarity which is defined by conflict, at least in the beginning?
Now, yes, we do have some debate, discussion that the possibility of the current world to go back to maybe a new Cold War pattern. I'm more, optimistic about the future of the relations, firstly between China and the U.S., and then how could we have a new shape of the international order? Because we are now in a very different, background. And thanks to the globalization. So now we can find out very, very deep and interdependency, even between China and the U.S. and between China and some other major players. So I don't think that there will be maybe a new, yes, some experts, some officials in Washington are talking about the decoupling issue frequently. But I don't think it will
decoupling.
be decoupling, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I don't think it will be a reality or will be a future for these relations, because I think at the same time we find that more than common interests between both some major powers or some other. So I don't think that yes, there will be some risk for go back to a new Cold War, but I think there will be more or much more positive force to push forward the international order into a more healthy and a more sustainable way.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next subject, which is also a very important country, Russia, and we're going to be joined by a specialist from Russia. He's Professor Alexander Lukin, head of the Department of International Relations of National Research University's Higher School of Economics. Right after this short break, stay with us. In 2019, we are going to celebrate the 70th anniversary of bilateral relations between China and Russia. I meant diplomatic relations between these two countries. And in 2018, that relationship grew really at an even higher pace and to a higher level. China became Russia's largest single trading partner, and the two countries' leaders also met with each other more than with any other world leaders, and have awarded each other's medals and even cooked a Russian dish, blinis, together. So, Professor Lukin, let me ask you, what has propelled the two countries to come even closer in 2018? And looking ahead in 2019, is that relationship going to continue to prosper?
Well, this year I published a book about it, so I can talk about it for a long time, but let me be rather short.
Please.
Well, the main idea of the book is that the improvement of relations and then rapprochement between Russia and China is a result of changes, fundamental changes in international situation. They don't depend on any third country or any other circumstances, because these two big, large centers of new centers of power in international relations just tend to cooperate as some other centers like Brazil, like India, because this is the reality, and they want to balance the influence or hegemony of the United States. But the two countries also need each other from the economic point of view, geopolitical point of view, and cooperate on all these areas. But we have some additional factor beginning from 2014 for Russia, and from, say, 2018 for China. The especially or extraordinary hostile policy of the United States, I would say. And this factor is an additional factor that moves two countries together.
Okay, a recent study by the National Bureau of Asian Research, which is a Seattle-based think tank, debated whether U.S. policy was at fault with driving Russia and China together, and asked if the U.S. should accommodate one while isolating the other, warning Washington of a potential two-front war. Is this argument well-founded? Is it really a concern for the United States, you think?
Well, it could be at fault if you think that it's a bad thing, Russia and China coming together. I think it's a good thing, and it's a thing that we should have done long ago. So I think it's a positive factor, the hostile policy of the United States for the for speeding up the rapprochement between the two countries. But now, of course, even from the American point of view, I would say from the realist point of view, like point of view of Mr. Kissinger and the like, it is kind of foolish to be hostile simultaneously towards Russia and China, what we can see from this administration and previous administration of the United States, because people like Kissinger, realists, they used to try to use China against the Soviet Union in the 1970s, sometimes used Soviet Union against China, and from their point of view, I think this was a wiser kind of policy. But today, the American and also European foreign policy is driven almost absolutely by ideological factors. So they want so-called world order, liberal world order, that is the order which they dominate. It's of course a myth, it doesn't exist, but they want it to exist. And because of that, they think that China and Russia are, as they call, revisionist power for this imaginary, for the mythological world order, and they want to punish them both at the same time from their ideological point of view. I would say that from the point of view of international relations theory, the liberal theories completely won their battle with political realism, and that's why they're doing this. Well, I think it's actually good for us. let them be like that for some more time, and we'll be even close.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander Lukin, Head of Department of International Relations of National Research University Higher School of Economics. And coming back to my two guests here in the studio, let's come back again to China's diplomacy in the year 2019. Of course, if you have anything to add on China's relationship with Russia, which is very important, you are more than welcome to add to that. In 2019, the most important diplomatic activity to be held on China's turf would be the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, where heads of state and governments will come again from around the world. Professor Cui, what is your prediction for China's determination and activities along this line? What are we going to see along in terms of Belt and Road activities?
China's foreign policy, I think that in the next year or maybe in next phase will be very clear, because now China, I think for Chinese leaders already, now they do have so many, we call the top-level designs, some very big initiatives, some very big commitment from government. So now I think for the next phase is how could we have some more implementation? How could we find out this maybe a more benefit model? For example, for this BRI. So I think 2019 there will be the first year. How could we push forward it into a more achievement, some more programmatic projects? I think that will be very, very important tests for this initiative.
Do you see China adjusting its strategy or proposals to countries around the world? Because during the first 5 years we have accumulated, we have experimented, we have seen the reaction, and there have been all kinds of doubts, suspicion or rejection or criticism, whatever you call it. Do you see China adjusting its way of deepening its cooperation with countries?
I don't think it's an issue of adjusting its policy of China. I think because the general direction, some principles will be keep continuing. As we know, how about this co-consulting and co-building everything. I think what we need to do, if right for this BRI, is we need to find out some more, flexibility and compatible cooperation. For example, some more synergies between China and some other partners. For example, this time, European Union proposed also this Europe-Asia connectivity strategy. So I think that we need to find out the way to keep them together and to keep them even some more programmatic cooperation. I think that's very important. At the same time, China need to have some more, I think, positive response to any kind of doubts from outside about the BRI. Once it is good, because a very important side for the BRI is China try to provide more public goods through the BRI. So once it's public goods, undoubtedly China should be more open and should be more transparent for any kind of doubts from outside.
But China is not going to step back from this option. However, Einar, are you seeing China and the United States coming into kind of a collision course? Because the United States, for instance, has just announced their African strategy. They have also outlined their answer to the BRI by setting up infrastructure funds, by announcing new U.S. foreign aid, overseas aid strategies. Do you see these two kind of policies coming to friction with each other?
No, not at all. I don't think there's much meat on what the U.S. is proposing. It's a series
and yet the determination is there to counter China's expansion of influence in Africa.
That is abundantly clear, militarily, economically, and politically. I don't think there's any question about that. I think what China needs to do is show proof through actions. And what I mean by that, instead of trying to do all these different links simultaneously, it needs to choose one, make it successful, put in the economic development zones, start creating jobs in these countries, and then people will follow. Remember, China cannot afford to bankroll this entire project. It needs, as you said, cooperators, and the best way to do that is success. There's no substitute. The U.S. has had ample opportunity to do all sorts of things over these many, many years, and the fact is it hasn't. So this Johnny-come-lately, we're going to kind of rain on China's parade is nothing more than a paper tiger at this point.
And yet, in reality, are Chinese projects or Chinese bids going to see more resistance or more hesitation? For instance, African countries are being kind of put in a rock and a hard place, you know, being forced to take sides between either the United States or China and Russia. Even if China does not want to, you know, create any problem for these countries might be hesitating.
Well, it's not a question of hesitating. No, I don't see it that way. I think these countries will be out for their own purposes, and they'll take money from whoever offers it. This has been the way that it has always been. These are countries who are in tremendous need of infrastructure projects. The U.S. was deeply involved for many years, but then abandoned Africa. It's not even on the radar. Neither is South America and Central America. So when you start looking at this, saying that we're going to do something when you had ample opportunity to do it before is not enough. China just needs to get stuck in and make sure that it can show success. Everyone will follow as soon as the jobs start appearing.
Well, the reason why I mention this is because there is really this discussion as to how the rest of the world are going to cope with this bipolarity that is emerging. Countries such as African countries or U.S.'s traditional allies, they're all kind of caught in between, right? Security alliance with the United States and economic relationship with China. Will countries increasingly have to really have a two-track foreign relations principle?
They already do. And that's the reality.
Is that going to expand in the year 2019?
It doesn't expand. I mean, look at what happened at APEC. Look at G20. What happened is the U.S. isolated itself. Pence got up and gave a speech. She gave his retort just on the 40th anniversary. So you have these situations occurring. The rest of the world wants a multilateral, open policy. The U.S. wants to reshape the world around the U.S. No one is in favor of that except Donald Trump and a few people in his administration.
And yet, the United States is not going to give up its dominance very easily. Professor Cui, are you going to see some really confrontations erupt, and not just on geopolitical terms, but also on technology, for instance, on finance or trade or rules in the multilateral trading regime?
I think now most of the countries or players, to some degree, including China and the United States and others, maybe now we are in a doubt that if we could be capable of creating a new way out of the history, I mean the so-called the Cold War mindset. So if we find out everywhere is a confrontation, competition between major powers in name of China, US, I think undoubtedly we'll go back to history. So I think now it will be a very big test. I think the 2019 will be a very, very critical time for China, US, if we could, sincerely, to find out more common interests and also to shoulder more and more common responsibilities as a major powers. So I think more cooperation, collaboration, and less competition and no confrontation, I think that would be a more optimistic picture for next year.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Einar Tangen, a current affairs commentator. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.